Eugene almost sent the recruiter's email straight to voicemail. 3 assistants in 4 weeks. He didn't have patience left for a 4th interview. But HR had promised flawless, and flawless was the only word that still worked on him. So he told his assistant to send the candidate up. The glass door swung open at 6:47 p.m. Dusk bleeding orange across the skyline behind her. And Eugene stopped breathing. Bridget Cole. Not the file photo. Not the ghost he'd spent 3 years telling himself he didn't think about. Her hair was different now. Pulled back. Practical. Nothing like the woman who used to walk these same halls before he'd made sure she never could again. She held a leather portfolio against her side like armor, and beneath it, unmistakable, was the curve of a pregnancy she made no effort to hide. He told himself it was a different Bridget Cole. A coincidence. The agency had made a clerical error. Then she looked at him. Steady. Unblinking. Not a flicker of the fear he'd once been so sure he'd left behind in her. And Eugene understood there had been no mistake at all. Eugene Park ran the 50th floor like a man who had never lost anything in his life. Boards deferred to him, rivals folded under a single email. The merger closing in 6 weeks would make him untouchable for a generation. None of that prepared him for a pregnant woman standing in his doorway, holding a folder, refusing to blink first. Bridget had spent 3 years rebuilding herself out of the wreckage he'd left behind. New city, blacklisted name, a baby coming with no father in the picture and no industry left that would hire her under her own name. She hadn't known who owned this company. She hadn't known the placement agency's confidential executive client was the man who'd ended her career to save his own. She only knew she was out of options, and this job was the last door still open to her. Tonight, by nothing but bad luck and a blind agency assignment, the 2 of them were standing on either side of a door neither could walk back through. Comment where you're reading this from. I'd genuinely love to say hi and see how far this one travels. Subscribe to this channel if this is your first time here. Now back to the story. Eugene Park's office occupied the entire northwest corner of the 50th floor, and he had designed it that way on purpose. Glass walls on 2 sides so the city could watch him work, and no chair on the visitor's side of his desk, lower than his own. A small detail, adjusted by half an inch that nobody ever consciously noticed, but that made every single person who sat across from him feel exactly 6 degrees less powerful than they walked in feeling. He wore black. Always black. A 3-piece suit tailored so precisely that his own mother had once joked he looked poured into it rather than dressed in it, the vest buttoned to the second to last, the shirt beneath left open at the collar just enough to suggest he could still be human if the occasion truly demanded it. The occasion rarely demanded it. By 34, Eugene had built a reputation that walked into rooms before he did. Deputy Chief of Strategy at Hallwood Kessler Group, heir apparent to a board seat his family had been circling for 2 generations, and the sole architect behind the international merger that was now 6 weeks from closing, a deal that would fold a struggling European logistics conglomerate into Hallwood Kessler's portfolio, and not incidentally cement Eugene's name as the man who'd done it. He had spent 11 months on the merger. He had slept, by his own count, an average of 5 hours a night for the last 4 of them. He had fired 2 junior analysts for rounding errors that cost the firm nothing but his patience, and he had done it without raising his voice, because raising his voice was for people who hadn't yet learned that silence, delivered correctly, was so much more efficient a weapon. His assistance did not last. It wasn't cruelty, he told himself. It was standards. The first of the year had cried in the elevator after he returned a briefing memo with 14 red marks on it. The second lasted 6 weeks before requesting a transfer to a floor, where in her exit interview she reportedly described working for him as surviving a controlled demolition on a loop. The third had quit that morning, mid-sentence, setting his coffee down on the corner of his desk, hard enough to slosh over the rim, and walking out without so much as a 2-week notice, muttering something about dignity that Eugene didn't have the bandwidth to absorb. Which was how, at 4:15 that afternoon, he'd found himself on the phone with HR, saying the word flawless the way other men said non-negotiable. "I don't care what it costs to poach someone," he told the recruiter. "I care that whoever walks through that door in 3 hours can survive a real week here. Not a polished résumé, not someone who's going to flinch the first time I raise an eyebrow. I need someone who has already been through worse than anything I can throw at them." The recruiter, a placement specialist named Dana who had learned over the years not to ask Eugene follow-up questions, said she had exactly one candidate who fit that description. A blind placement through a discretion tier agency, someone whose full employment history wasn't even in the file Dana had been given, someone who'd been vetted for competence and availability and nothing else. Eugene didn't ask why the file was incomplete. He didn't have time to care. He told her to send the candidate up the moment she arrived, and then he turned back to the merger deck open on his 3 monitors, because in 6 weeks he was going to stand in front of Hallward Kessler's board and hand them the deal of the decade, and nothing, not a coffee stain, not a resignation, not even his own bone-deep exhaustion, was going to slow that down. He didn't look up when the elevator chimed at 6:47. He didn't look up when his outer office went quiet in that particular way it did when someone new was standing at the threshold, uncertain where to go. He looked up only when the heavy glass door of his own office swung inward on its silent hinge, because some old animal instinct in the base of his skull told him, half a second before his eyes caught up, that something in the room had just changed permanently. Bridget Cole stood in his doorway. He knew her instantly, and then, in the same breath, tried to unknow her, tried to tell himself it was a resemblance, a trick of the low light. Anyone could have that same steady set to their jaw. But it was her, older around the eyes in a way that had nothing to do with age. Her hair pulled back into a low, neat bun instead of the loose waves she used to wear on Fridays when she thought no one from leadership was watching. A grey cardigan over a white blouse, plain, unremarkable, the kind of clothing a person chose when they had stopped dressing for anyone's approval but their own comfort. One hand still gripped the door's silver handle as though she hadn't yet decided whether she was staying. The other arm cradled a brown leather portfolio against her side, and beneath it, unmistakable, impossible to look away from once he'd seen it, was the round, high curve of a pregnancy she had made absolutely no attempt to disguise. Eugene's whole body went still in a way it never had in a boardroom, a deposition, a hostile takeover call. His hand, halfway to the pen on his desk, simply stopped moving and hung there in the air between them like it belonged to someone else. It's a coincidence, he told himself. A different Bridget Cole. A common enough name. But she looked at him, and there was no confusion in her face at all. No double take, no flicker of surprise at seeing him behind that desk. She had known exactly whose office this was before she walked into it, which meant she had walked in anyway. "Mr. Park," she said. Her voice was even, professional, entirely without tremor. "Dana sent me up. I understand you need an assistant." 3 years ago, Eugene had stood in a different boardroom and watched a different set of executives review a fabricated compliance report with his signature nowhere on it and Bridget Cole's name attached to every falsified line. He remembered the particular silence of that room. Not shocked, not outraged, just efficient, the silence of people executing a decision they'd already made before the meeting started. He remembered walking past her desk that same afternoon, her things already boxed by security, her face doing something complicated that he had told himself, at the time, wasn't his problem to interpret. He had been 29 years old and 1 promotion away from everything he had now, and the board had made it very clear whose career would survive the quarter and whose wouldn't? He had chosen. He had not thought about that choice well, that was a lie too. He thought about it more than he let himself admit, usually at 3 a.m, usually with a second scotch already poured. And now she was standing in his doorway asking, with the flat, unbothered courtesy of a stranger, whether he needed an assistant. "Sit down," he said, and was faintly disgusted to hear that his own voice had lost its usual register of command. "I'll stand, if that's all right. Long day." She said it without any weight to it at all. No accusation buried in the words, which somehow made it worse. She set the portfolio on the edge of his desk, squared it precisely to the corner, and folded her hands in front of her. "I was told the position requires someone available for irregular hours, high-pressure deadlines, and international coordination across time zones. I've managed larger portfolios than that. I assume you have questions about the gap in my employment history." He did. He had approximately 400 of them, none of which he could ask without confessing to the very thing he'd spent 3 years making sure no one could prove. "The agency vetted you," he said instead, which was a coward's sentence, and he knew it the moment it left his mouth. "The agency vetted my output," Bridget said. "Not my references. I imagine you understand why I didn't have any to give them." Her eyes held his for 1 full second longer than was comfortable, and in that second Eugene understood, with total clarity, that she had known exactly where she was walking into the moment Dana's agency called her, that she had weighed it and taken the assignment anyway, and that whatever had brought her back through this door had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with a set of circumstances he could not yet see the shape of. "I took a blind placement, Mr. Park, because blind placements are the only kind of work left to me. I'd like the job. I'd also like us both to skip the part where you decide whether I deserve to be standing here. I already had that conversation with myself a long time ago." Eugene said nothing for a long moment. Outside the glass, the city had gone the particular deep blue of full dusk, lights coming up block by block like something catching fire in slow motion. He thought about the merger. He thought about the board. He thought, despite every instinct telling him not to, about the way her hand had rested against the curve of her stomach for just a second while she spoke, unconsciously, protectively, before she caught herself and let it fall back to her side. "You start tomorrow," he said, 7 a.m. "I'll be here at 6:30, Bridget said, picked up her portfolio, and walked out without waiting to be dismissed, which no one, in 4 years, had ever done to Eugene Park in his own office. He told himself, once the door had closed behind her, that hiring her was strategic, that a woman with nothing left to lose and nowhere else to work made an assistant who would never leak, never gossip, never run to a competitor with insider knowledge of the merger, because her name was so thoroughly burned in the industry that no competitor would touch her regardless of what she brought them. It was, he told himself, simply good risk management. He did not let himself examine. That night, or for several nights after, the other reason sitting underneath that one, the reason that looked less like strategy and more like the beginning of a debt coming due. He decided within 48 hours that the only sensible course of action was to make the job unbearable. It wasn't difficult to justify to himself. The merger genuinely did require a punishing pace, reconciling 3 sets of financial disclosures across 2 currencies and 4 regulatory regimes, coordinating with legal teams in Frankfurt and Singapore who kept inconveniently different business hours, managing the daily brushfires of due diligence that threatened, at any given moment, to become the kind of story that made the deal collapse. Eugene simply made sure that every one of those brushfires landed on Bridget's desk first, and that the deadlines attached to them left no room for anything resembling a normal life. He gave her the Hallward-Kessler disclosure reconciliation on her second day, 412 pages across 3 languages, due by 9 the following morning. She had it flagged, cross-referenced, and color-coded by discrepancy severity on his desk at 8:50, with a 2-line summary at the top identifying an accounting error the outside auditors had missed entirely. He asked her, on her 4th day, to sit in on a call with the Frankfurt legal team at 11 p.m. An hour he chose specifically, because it would require her either to still be in the office or to log in from wherever she was living. And either way, he reasoned, it would tell him something about the shape of her life now. She joined the call from the office, sharp and precise in 3 languages he hadn't realized she spoke, and afterward handed him a memo summarizing the 6 action items in a format so clean he could have forwarded it to the board unedited, which, after a beat of considering whether doing so would feel too much like an admission of something, he did. He tested her on the small things, too, the petty things, the things he was not proud of engineering, contradictory instructions given 20 minutes apart, meetings rescheduled 3 times in a single afternoon, a request for a 5-year comparative analysis of subsidiary tax exposure that he privately estimated would take a competent analyst the better part of a week. She delivered it in 2 days, complete with a footnote flagging an inconsistency in his own numbers from 18 months earlier that, had it gone unnoticed, would have caused him real embarrassment in front of the board. Not once did she complain. Not once did her voice rise, or her hands shake, or her composure slip into the visible cracks he had, if he was honest with himself, been hunting for. She was, without exception, better at the job than anyone who had ever sat in that chair before her. Better, if he let himself think it all the way through, than he had any right to expect from someone he had once helped destroy. It was the 10th night, close to midnight, when he found her still at her desk outside his office, reviewing a supplemental filing by the glow of her monitor, one hand pressed briefly to the small of her back before she caught herself and returned it to the keyboard. And Eugene understood. With the sudden, unwelcome clarity of a man realizing he has lost an argument he didn't know he was having, that he was not breaking her. He was only exposing, with every impossible task he handed her, exactly how much he had underestimated her 3 years ago, and exactly how much smaller a man he had become in comparison. He told himself that night that he needed to know what had happened to her in the years between. Not out of guilt, he insisted internally, but out of due diligence, because a woman with a blacklisted name and no visible support system was a risk he needed to understand before the merger closed. It was, again, strategic. He almost believed it. The contact he called was a man named Reyes, who had done quiet work for Hallwood Kessler before, background checks that stayed several careful degrees outside what any compliance officer would want documented. Eugene gave him Bridget's name and told him to keep it simple, employment history, current residence, nothing invasive. Reyes called back 4 days later, and Eugene could tell from the flatness in the man's voice, before a single fact was delivered, that whatever was in the file wasn't going to sit easily. It arrived as a single manila folder, thinner than Eugene expected, as though 3 years of a person's life could be compressed into 11 pages if enough of it had simply been taken away. He read it standing at his window, city lights spread out below him, like something he no longer felt entitled to. Bridget had been fired from Hallwood Kessler on a Tuesday in March, 3 years ago, on falsified compliance charges that Eugene knew, better than anyone alive, were fabricated. Her industry references had gone cold within a month, not accidentally, the file suggested, but through a quiet campaign of calls made to exactly the right people, calls that painted her as untrustworthy without ever using a word that could be traced back to a source. She'd applied, according to the file, to over 60 positions in her field over 18 months. She'd been rejected from all of them, or simply never called back. She had at one point taken work at a call center under a version of her middle name, a job so far beneath her training that Eugene felt something twist low in his chest just reading the line. There was an eviction notice, 11 months old, for a one-bedroom apartment in a part of the city Eugene had never once had reason to drive through. There was a gap of 4 months with no verifiable employment at all, a stretch of time the file simply marked unaccounted, and Eugene found that single clinical word harder to look at than anything else on the page. The pregnancy wasn't in the file. Reyes hadn't gone that far, or hadn't found it, or had drawn a line Eugene hadn't asked him to draw, and was grateful, in some buried part of himself, that he had. Eugene sat with the folder open on his desk for a long time after he finished reading it, the office dark except for his desk lamp, the city indifferent and glittering beyond the glass. He thought about the board members who had engineered her downfall, men who were, at this very moment, almost certainly still congratulating themselves on protecting the firm's optics that quarter, men who had used him, a 29-year-old hungry for a promotion, as the instrument of a decision they didn't want their own fingerprints on. He thought about how easy it had been, at the time, to tell himself it was business. He thought about the eviction notice, and the call centre job under a half name, and the 4 unaccounted months, and he understood, with a nausea he hadn't felt in years, that every single one of those facts led back through a chain of decisions to a signature he had let someone else forge under his authority, because stopping it would have cost him the very career he was now sitting inside of. He put the folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, the one that locked, and did not sleep that night at all. He found her 2 evenings later, at the exit nearest the East Elevator Bank, the one people used when they wanted to leave without passing the main lobby's security desk, the one Eugene himself used more often than he'd admit. It was just past 7, the sky doing its slow blue-orange fold into night, and Bridget was standing with her coat half on, her portfolio tucked under one arm, one hand braced against the wall as though she'd stopped mid-motion to catch her breath. "You're leaving early," he said, which wasn't true. It was barely past 7, and she had worked past midnight 3 of the last 5 days. But it was the only sentence he could locate in the moment. "I have an appointment," Bridget said, not turning fully toward him. "I'll make up the hours tomorrow." "I'm not asking you to make up the hours." He heard his own voice come out lower than he meant it to, stripped of the register he used in boardrooms. "I'm asking why you're here at all." She turned then, and the last of the daylight through the far windows caught her face at an angle that made the exhaustion under her eyes impossible to miss. Exhaustion she had been carrying, he now understood, every single day since she'd walked through his door, and he had simply chosen not to see it. "You already know why," she said. "You had someone pull my file. Don't look surprised, Mr. Park. A man like you doesn't hire a stranger for a position this close to a merger without knowing exactly what he's inviting into the building." Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. But something in it had gone very still and very precise, the way a scalpel is precise. "So let's not do the part where you pretend not to know." Eugene said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. "You want to know if I came back for revenge?" Bridget said. "That's what's been running underneath every impossible deadline you've handed me for 2 weeks. Whether I'm here to burn your merger down the way you let them burn my career down." She laughed once, without any humor in it at all. "I didn't know it was you. I want you to sit with that because I don't think you understand what that means. I didn't research this company before I took the assignment. I couldn't afford to be picky about which company I worked for. I could only afford to say yes. The agency doesn't disclose the client until you're standing in the lobby. So no, Eugene, I didn't walk through that door to destroy you. I walked through it because it was the only door still open, and I have a child coming in 11 weeks, and pride is a luxury I gave up somewhere around the 2nd month I couldn't make rent." She let that sit in the space between them, and Eugene found he had no defense against it, none at all. Every instinct that usually armored him in a negotiation simply gone. "Do you know what it's like?" She went on, quieter now. "To watch every door you spent a decade building close in the same season because someone with more power than you decided your career was worth less than his? I sent out 60 applications. I got 4 callbacks, and every single one of them evaporated the moment someone made a phone call I never heard, but always felt the effect of. I worked a call center under my mother's maiden name, because Bridget Cole wasn't hireable anymore. Not in this city, not in this industry. I lost the apartment I'd had for 6 years. I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after I lost it. And I have spent every day since then getting up anyway, because falling apart wasn't a service anyone was offering me for free. Bridget, I'm not finished. Her hand had come to rest, unconsciously again, against the curve of her stomach, and this time she didn't pull it away. You've spent 2 weeks trying to see how much I'd bend before I broke. I understand why. Guilt makes people cruel in strange shapes, Eugene, and I think some part of you needed me to fail so you wouldn't have to think about what you'd be if I didn't. But I'm not going to break for your convenience. Not this time. I survived losing everything without your help, and I will survive working for you the same way. By doing the job better than anyone you've ever hired, and by refusing to give you the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in front of you a second time. The city had gone fully dark behind her now, the exit sign above the door casting its dull red glow across the side of her face. And Eugene, a man who had spent his entire adult life ensuring he was never the one left without a response, found he had nothing. No strategy, no angle, no version of himself left standing that could argue with what she had just said, because every word of it was true. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and the words felt foreign in his mouth, unpracticed, nothing like the careful language he used in every other room in this building. "I know that doesn't undo any of it. I know it doesn't fix 11 pages of a life you shouldn't have had to live. But I am sorry, Bridget. I should have said it 3 years ago." Something flickered across her face. Not forgiveness. Nothing so simple as that, but something that looked, for just a moment, like a door left open half an inch instead of closed entirely. "It's a start," she said quietly. "It's not enough, but it's a start." And then she pulled her coat the rest of the way on, turned and walked out into the dusk without looking back, leaving Eugene standing alone by the east exit with the weight of 11 pages and a lifetime of small cowardices settling over him like something he was only now, far too late, beginning to understand he would have to answer for. He stood there a long time after the door had swung shut behind her, the red exit sign humming faintly overhead, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Eugene Park had absolutely no idea what he was going to do next. If you've made it this far, drop the city you're reading from in the comments. I want to know exactly how far Eugene and Bridget's story has traveled tonight. The discrepancy was small enough that Eugene almost scrolled past it, a decimal shift in the subsidiary valuation table, 3 lines down from a figure he'd checked a dozen times already. The kind of thing that looked, at first glance, like a rounding artifact from currency conversion. He might have let it go entirely if Bridget hadn't flagged the same page 4 days earlier with a single sticky note that said only, "Confirm source," in the small, precise handwriting he'd come to recognize on every document that passed through her hands before it reached his desk. He pulled the original filing. Then he pulled the version that had gone out to the European regulators the week before. The numbers didn't match, not by much, not enough to trip an automated audit, but enough that if the deal closed on the inflated figure and the truth surfaced afterward, Hallward Kessler would be looking at a securities fraud investigation instead of a merger celebration. He checked the document metadata next, the small invisible fingerprints buried in every file that told you who had actually touched it and when, and felt something in his chest go cold and very still when he saw the edit history. The changes hadn't come from his team. They hadn't come from legal, or from the Frankfurt office, or from anyone whose name would show up on a standard org chart. They'd come from a shared drive folder with access limited to 4 people, and 3 of those 4 people sat on the Hallwood-Kessler board, including Marcus Whitfield, the man who had chaired that boardroom 3 years ago when Bridget's career was quietly disassembled, the man who had personally walked 29-year-old Eugene into his office afterward and told him, with something that had felt at the time like fatherly pride, that he'd made the right call. Eugene spent 2 nights going through everything Marcus's faction had touched in the last month, and the pattern that emerged made his stomach turn in a way the merger itself never had. The inflated valuation wasn't a mistake. It was a plant, a deliberate overstatement that, if it surfaced during due diligence, would look exactly like the work of someone new to the account, someone without the institutional history to know better, someone whose login credentials were all over the file system, because she was, by design, touching every document that crossed Eugene's desk. They were building a case against Bridget before she'd done anything wrong at all. He understood it the way you understand a joke a beat too late, the sick, lurching recognition that the punchline had been aimed at him the entire time, not because Marcus cared about Bridget one way or another, but because a scapegoat with no allies, no references, and a blacklisted name was the safest possible container for whatever had actually gone wrong with the merger numbers. And Eugene, distracted by his own guilt and his own late nights, had handed them exactly that container without even realizing what he'd built. He didn't confront Marcus. Not yet. He sat with it instead, turning it over at 2 a.m. with the folder from the bottom drawer of his desk open beside the falsified filings, and understood, with a clarity that felt less like a decision and more like a debt finally coming due, that he had exactly 1 chance to protect her, and it depended entirely on not tipping his hand before he knew how far they were willing to go. He found out 4 days later, and it was worse than he'd let himself imagine. The alert came through at 11:40 on a Thursday night, a security flag from IT, routine on its face, escalating within the hour into something that had every screen on the 50th floor lit up with red. A data breach. Merger blueprints, valuation models, the entire due diligence file for the European acquisition, pulled and transmitted to an external server sometime after 9 p.m. and logged cleanly, unambiguously, under Bridget Cole's credentials. Eugene was still in the building when it happened. He'd taken to staying later than he needed to, some instinct telling him not to leave the floor unwatched, and he made it to the security office in under 3 minutes, badge still in hand, to find 4 members of corporate security already pulled the access logs and 2 board members already on a conference line, their voices coming through the speaker with the particular calm of men who had rehearsed this exact outcome. "The credentials are unambiguous," Marcus was saying, and Eugene recognized the tone instantly. It was the same tone from 3 years ago, reasonable, regretful, entirely certain. "I know this is difficult, given the circumstances of her hire, but we cannot let personal sympathy compromise the integrity of a 9-figure transaction. I want her access terminated tonight, security escort out of the building, and legal drafting a statement for the SEC filing by morning. We protect the stock price. We protect the deal. That has to come before anything else." "She didn't do this," Eugene said, and every head in the room turned toward him. "The logs say otherwise," said the second board member, a woman named Halloran, who Eugene had always privately considered Marcus's more efficient shadow. "I understand you hired her personally, Eugene, which frankly raises its own questions about judgment, but the timestamp is clean. Her badge, her login, her IP address inside this building at the hour of transmission. Anyone with her credentials could have logged in remotely," Eugene said. "Anyone with administrative access to the shared drive could have pulled those files without ever touching her machine. I want a full forensic trace before anyone says her name to the SEC." "There isn't time for a forensic trace," Marcus said, and something in his voice had gone flatter now, less patient. "Eugene, I understand the impulse to protect someone you feel responsible for. I remember having that same impulse myself once before I learned that this business doesn't leave room for it. We handled a difficult situation together 3 years ago because you understood, even then, that protecting the firm sometimes means making an unpopular call about one individual's career. I need you to understand that again tonight. The room went very quiet. Eugene understood in that silence that Marcus had just said the thing out loud that both of them had spent 3 years pretending had never happened, had said it as a threat disguised as a reminiscence, a reminder that Eugene's own hands weren't clean, that if this went to a real investigation, it wouldn't only be Bridget's history that got dragged into the light. He thought about the 11 pages in his bottom drawer. He thought about the eviction notice, and the call center job under a half name, and the way her hand had come to rest against her stomach at the east exit, while she told him she had given up the luxury of pride. He thought about the child coming in a matter of weeks, and the fact that a legal destruction campaign launched from this room tonight would follow that child before it ever had a chance to know its mother's real name wasn't the one people whispered about in this industry. "Where is she now?" he asked. "Being brought up from the lobby," a security officer said. "We called her in when the alert triggered, told her it was an urgent document issue. She's 7 months pregnant." Eugene said, "You called her back into this building at midnight to walk her into an ambush." "We called her in to answer for a 9-figure security breach." Halloran said, "I'd remind you where your priorities are supposed to sit, Eugene." The elevator chimed behind them, and Bridget stepped out into the hallway. Coat still buttoned, clearly pulled from wherever she'd been at home, her face doing the thing it always did under pressure, which was nothing at all, a stillness so complete it looked to anyone who didn't know her like guilt. 2 security officers moved toward her immediately, and Eugene watched her spine straighten the way it had the very first night she'd walked through his door, refusing, even now, to let anyone see her flinch. "Someone want to explain why I was told to come back for a document emergency?" she said, "and instead find security waiting for me?" "Ms. Cole," Marcus said smoothly, stepping forward with the practiced warmth of a man who had done this before. "We've had a significant data breach traced to your login. Given the sensitivity of the materials involved, we're going to need you to surrender your badge and accompany our team for a formal interview. Legal will be present. I want to stress that this is a serious matter, and the firm intends to pursue it to the fullest extent necessary to protect our shareholders." Bridget didn't look at Marcus. She looked at Eugene, and there was something in her face in that moment. Not fear, he realized, but a terrible, resigned recognition. The look of a woman who had lived this exact scene before and had known, on some level, from the day she walked through his office door, that it might come around again. "Eugene," she said, quiet, controlled, "tell them I didn't do this." And Eugene understood, standing in that hallway with the whole weight of his career balanced on the next several seconds, that he had a choice he had already failed to make once, 3 years ago, in a different room, with a different version of himself who had told himself it wasn't his fight. It was his fight now. It had always been his fight. He had simply spent 3 years pretending otherwise. "She's telling the truth," Eugene said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected. "And before anyone touches her badge, I want everyone in this hallway to hear something. Because I'm done letting this company protect itself by destroying people who never had the power to fight back." "Eugene," Marcus said, a warning now, no warmth left in it at all. 3 years ago, this board asked me to falsify a compliance report and attach Bridget Cole's name to it," Eugene said, loud enough that the words carried down the corridor, loud enough that 2 junior security officers exchanged a glance. Neither of them tried to hide. "I did it. I was 29 and hungry for the promotion you were dangling in front of me, and I signed off on a lie that cost this woman her career, her home, and 3 years of her life, and I have known it every single day since and said nothing, because saying something would have cost me everything I'd built on top of that lie." He turned, found the nearest security camera mounted in the corner of the hallway, and looked directly into it. "That's on the record now, and whatever data breach happened tonight, it did not happen on Bridget Cole's authority, because the last time this board needed someone disposable to protect its numbers, they used me to do it to her. And I am telling you, in front of witnesses, that it is not happening again." The hallway went utterly silent. Marcus's face, for the first time in the years Eugene had known him, showed something other than composed authority. A flicker of genuine alarm, quickly smoothed over, but not quickly enough. "You understand what you've just done to your own career?" Marcus said quietly. "I understand what I should have done to it 3 years ago." Eugene said, "Pull the forensic trace. Check every login that touched that shared drive in the last month, not just the one that's convenient. And if you want to press charges against Bridget Cole tonight, you're going to have to press them against me too, on the record, in front of the same legal team, because I am not letting her walk out of this building carrying that alone a second time." No one moved for a long moment. Then Bridget, still standing very straight in the middle of the hallway, pressed one hand briefly against her stomach. Not a gesture of distress, Eugene realized, but of steadying herself, of holding on to the one certainty in a room full of people who had just watched a decade of careful architecture come apart in 90 seconds. "I want the forensic trace," she said, calm and clear. "Tonight. I have nothing to hide, and I'd like the record to reflect that clearly, since apparently my word alone has never been enough in this building." It took 11 hours. Eugene stayed the entire time, refusing every suggestion that he go home, refusing Marcus's increasingly agitated attempts to pull him aside for a private conversation, sitting instead in a windowless conference room with outside forensic auditors, while they traced the breach back through the shared drive's access logs to an IP address that belonged, unambiguously, to a residential address 3 blocks from Marcus Whitfield's summer house, a spoofed credential login designed to look exactly like Bridget's badge activity, time-stamped by someone who had access to her schedule and had planned the breach for a night they knew. From her calendar, she'd already left the building. By 6 a.m., the board had what it needed to understand exactly who had engineered both the falsified valuations and the breach designed to bury them under Bridget's name. By 7, 2 board members Eugene had known for a decade were being escorted out by the same security team that had been called to remove Bridget 6 hours earlier. Marcus resigned before the board could formally vote him out, releasing a statement about wanting to spend more time with his family that fooled absolutely no one who had stood in that hallway. Eugene's own position didn't survive the morning, and he hadn't expected it to. A confession on record, on camera, admitting to falsifying a compliance filing 3 years earlier, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of who had pressured him into it, was not something the board's legal counsel could simply set aside. And by 9 a.m. he was informed, with the same careful, regretful language he had once used on other people, that his resignation would be accepted effective immediately, and that the firm would be issuing a statement distancing itself from his historical conduct. He signed the paperwork without arguing. He left his badge on the conference table, unbuttoned his suit jacket for what felt like the first time in years, and did not put it back on. Bridget was still in the building when it was over, sitting in the small, windowless office they'd given her for the forensic interview, exhaustion written into every line of her posture, one hand resting against her stomach in a way that had stopped being unconscious and started looking, to Eugene, like something closer to protection. The media vans had already begun gathering outside. Someone on the board's staff had leaked the shape of the story before. The ink on Marcus's resignation was even dry, and Eugene understood. watching the cameras multiply on the sidewalk 50 floors below, that whatever came next for both of them was going to happen in public, whether either of them wanted it to or not. "You didn't have to do that," Bridget said when he came to find her. She looked up at him with something in her face he hadn't seen there before. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated, more wary. A woman who had learned the hard way not to trust rescues that came dressed as redemption. "Yes, I did," Eugene said. "I should have done it 3 years ago, when it would have cost me nothing but a promotion. Doing it now, when it costs me everything, doesn't undo that. But it's the only version of the truth I have left to offer you." She was quiet for a moment, studying him. "I don't want your guilt," she said finally. "I've carried enough weight for both of us. If you're doing this because you need to feel better about what happened, I can't use that." "I'm not doing it so I feel better," Eugene said. "I don't think I get to feel better. I'm doing it because there's a media scrum forming downstairs, and in about 20 minutes they are going to have your name and your photograph and absolutely no context for either one, and I am not going to let you walk out that front door alone to face it, 7 months pregnant, exhausted, and blamed for something you didn't do. Not again. Not while I have a car, a driver, and a back exit that isn't currently surrounded by cameras." Something in her shoulders eased, fractionally, the smallest possible give. "Okay," she said. "Not because I trust you, because I'm tired and my feet hurt and I'd like to not be photographed today." "That's fair," Eugene said, and it was the most honest exchange either of them had managed in 3 years. He walked her out through the service corridor and the loading dock, past startled kitchen staff and a security guard who looked at Eugene's bare collar, his jacket slung over one arm, his badge already surrendered, and said nothing at all. His car was waiting where he'd asked his driver to bring it, 2 blocks from the nearest camera, and he held the door for her himself, the way he hadn't held a door for anyone since long before this whole story started. In the weeks that followed, the story broke exactly the way Eugene had expected it to. His name across every business page in the city, the merger collapsing under the weight of the fraud investigation, Hallward Kessler's stock taking a hit that would keep analysts talking for a full quarter. He gave one interview, brief and unemotional, confirming the facts of what he'd done 3 years earlier and declining to elaborate further. And then he stopped answering calls from reporters altogether. He used what remained of his personal wealth, considerable even after the fallout, because men like Eugene were never as financially exposed as their public disgrace suggested, to quietly cover Bridget's legal fees, to make sure the forensic evidence stayed attached permanently to her public record so that no future employer could ever again whisper the word blacklisted near her name, and to do it all in a way that left no room for anyone to call it charity, because he understood, finally, that what he owed her wasn't kindness. It was correction. He didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't visit unannounced, didn't call more than the occasional practical check-in required, didn't try to insert himself into the last stretch of her pregnancy, as though 3 months of decent behavior could balance 3 years of damage. He simply showed up, consistently, in small, unglamorous ways. A lawyer's number when she needed one, a reference that finally meant something when she started interviewing again, a willingness to answer, honestly, any question she asked about what exactly had happened in that boardroom 3 years ago, no matter how much it cost him to say it out loud. It took the better part of a year before she let him closer than that. And even then it was slow, careful, built one small act at a time, rather than any single grand gesture. Because Bridget had learned, the hard way, that grand gestures were exactly the kind of thing men like Eugene used to buy their way out of consequences, and what she needed instead was proof, repeated and boring and undeniable, that he had actually changed. He started the new firm 8 months after he left Hallward Kessler, Small, deliberately so, 3 rented rooms above a bakery in a part of the city that had never seen a Hallward Kessler business card, built around a set of ethics policies he wrote himself, in longhand, the first week, and never let a lawyer soften. No blind placements used as legal shields. No falsified filings ever, for any reason, no matter what a client's board of directors decided was strategically necessary. He named it after nothing. No family legacy, no inherited weight, just 3 plain words that meant nothing to anyone but him and the handful of people who'd agreed to build it with him. A year to the day after Bridget had walked through his office door for the first time, Eugene stood in the doorway of that small office above the bakery, watching her review a quarterly report at the desk she'd chosen for herself. Not an assistant's desk this time, but a director's. Her name on the door beside his. A title she had earned back one impossible, immaculate piece of work at a time, on her own terms, at her own pace. Her daughter was 6 months old, asleep in a portable bassinet tucked in the corner of the office, one small fist curled against her cheek, and Bridget looked up from the report to check on her every few minutes with the kind of unconscious tenderness that had nothing left in it of the guarded stillness she'd worn like armor the first night they'd met. "You're staring," Bridget said, without looking up. "I'm thinking," Eugene said, "that I spent a decade building something I was terrified to lose, and it took losing all of it to understand I'd never actually built anything worth keeping." Bridget finally looked up at him, and there was something easier in her face now than there had been in a long time. Not forgiveness handed over freely, never that simple, but something adjacent to it, something built out of a year of small proofs instead of one large apology. "This is worth keeping," she said, nodding at the small office, the bassinet, the modest sign downstairs that had replaced 50 floors of glass and marble with 3 rooms and an honest set of rules. "It's smaller, it's slower. Some days it's harder than anything either of us built before." She glanced down at her daughter, then back at him. "But nobody in this building has ever asked me to disappear to protect their numbers. That's worth more than the view from the 50th floor ever was." Eugene didn't argue with that, because there was nothing in him left that wanted to. If you've stayed with Eugene and Bridget all the way to the end, tell me where you started reading this from, and where you are now. I'd love to know how far this journey carried you.